But you probably do not know me as the director of studies, which is at the United Center. So, who actually makes all these I'll just do a very brief introduction to, and then we'll get into it, and then we'll have. I'm hoping for the record. Professor Timur Hammond is an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environment at Syracuse University's Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs. He received a PhD and an MA in Geography from the University of California, in San Francisco. And he did his undergrad at the University of North Carolina. I'm teaching at the faculty. Prior to joining the faculty at Syracuse University, he worked with the Department of Geography at the University of Vermont. He is trained as an urban and cultural geographer. His research draws on archival and ethnographic methods to explore the intersection between urban experience and religious beliefs, particularly in 20th century Turkey. And I believe that this is the book just literally just came out like that. May. So this is a brand new book that we've been looking forward to. This is the second time that Professor Hammond comes to Brunel. The first time he was here, he actually came to a graduate course that I was doing that is called Space and Place in the Middle East. And we read one of your earlier articles, but we were looking forward to this book, which is finally out, and it's called Placing Islam, Geographies of Connection in 20th Century Islam. Please help me.
First and foremost, a big thank you to Mustafa and Maeve and Cornell for the invitation to join you. Thank you so much to everyone for being here today. One of the things I've often tried to do in my writing is build linkages between disparate disciplines and conversations. That can sometimes be a lonely and uncertain task. Interdisciplinarity is challenging in many ways, but I'm really grateful to people like Mustafa, and so particularly for the grad students, you're very lucky to kind of be in an environment that nurtures the kind of interdisciplinary conversations that I think are so important. So I'm really honored and grateful to be one small part. This is a first for me. It's the first time I've given a talk about scholarship that's already been published, as opposed to new material that I've been working through. So what I want to try to do this afternoon are a couple of things. The first is give you a sense of the broad intervention that the book seeks to make, and how it goes about doing it. And then I'll draw from a few sections of the book, working between reading a few passages and then adding points of discussion and revision that I wanted to make. One of the things, unfortunately, you'll find for those of you who plan to publish books is as soon as you publish them, you will immediately realize, oh, here are all the things that I wish I had said. So there will be a couple moments where I talk about some things that I wish I had done more. The talk today is going to have 5 sections. They're not all going to be equal in length. So I'll give you a welcome to Eyüp to orient you all, but particularly those who might never have been to Istanbul. I'll then kind of briefly talk about this idea of where is Islam, which is in many ways the core conceptual theoretical intervention the book seeks to make. And I'll explain how this is in conversation with a book that some of you may know, Shahab Ahmed's What is Islam? From there, I'll run through 3 sort of empirical sections drawn from the book. One is about dreams of conquest, Istanbul under occupation, thinking about the way, what was at stake at telling a story about Eyüp and about this companion of the Prophet Muhammad in 1922. I'll then talk about a chapter I call Fluid Stories, and think about the role that water plays as a sort of substance of the divine in Eyüp. And then I'll close with a longer discussion about a chapter called Ottoman Topographies, where we'll focus on the discussion of the 1990s projects that reshaped Eyüp, something that I kind of update with a recent little bit of writing I've been doing about the building known as Fesane that brings it to the present day. So, where is Eyüp? If you'd never visited Istanbul, much less Eyüp, you might begin where many searches begin: Google. A few keystrokes later, you might see a screen with a range of information. A blurb from Wikipedia tells us that Eyüp, or Eyüpsultan, is a district of Istanbul without commenting on the difference. Another panel juxtaposes a view of the Golden Horn. You are given points of interest, destinations, questions that people ask. Which prophet is buried into? Who is Eyüpsultan? Where did Eyüp come from? Each of these pieces of information is partial, but at first glance, searching for Eyüp in Google enacts a particular kind of place, one where facts and stories can be coordinated, presented, and located in a transparent, legible way. But there are other ways of locating Eyüp. Some longtime residents, for example, make Eyüp a place of social relationships and shared memories. Their Eyüp is located not just somewhere, but somewhere. Their stories would take you from central Eyüp to the constellation of neighborhoods that extend in all directions. The Kar Çeşme and Deftergar as you head back toward the Byzantine land walls. Nişancı, extending up the ridge leading to Edirne Kapı. Düğmeciler tucked into the valley beneath the ridge of Rami. Islam Bey as you head up the old stream bed toward the hills beyond. The old fields and meadows of Çırçır, Karyardı, and Gümüşsuyu. And along the shore of the Golden Horn as it narrows, there's Silahtara and Arıbeyköy. While each of these neighborhoods has its own history, what matters is less the exact boundaries between them, and more the way that they organize a sense of place. Their Eyüp is enacted through the everyday acts of neighborliness, phone calls and text messages, social media posts, and special events. For these residents, many of these relationships and memories were linked to material sites like schools, factories, gardens, bakeries, coffee houses, the open-air cinema. You see here is a coffee house well known in the history of Eyüp, the Shark Kahvesi, run by a member of the Heper family, who's a kind of a very well-known family at the turn of the 20th century. Were you to visit today, however, you'd find just a few of these sites still standing, such as the school endowed by and located just by the tomb of Sultan Rashad. Despite these buildings and ongoing efforts to maintain connections to their shared social relations, other longtime residents also look at the district where they live and say, Eyüp is gone, Eyüp yok olmuş. They experience this place as a site of loss, one where the built environment and its contemporary urban life mark absence and change. But then, of course, there are also people who would tell me that Eyüp hasn't changed, and it hasn't changed because of the figure at its center, Khalid bin Zayd Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, the companion or Sahaba of the Prophet Muhammad. They would tell me, if he, meaning Khalid bin Zayd, hadn't been, none of this, pointing to the mosques, the crowds, the people visiting, would ever have been. Olmasaydı, burası olmazdı. So this phrase locates Eyüp as a place that changes, not as a place that changes, but as a place unchanged. So in short, there are many different ways to answer the question, where is Eyüp? These many possible answers pose a puzzle, whose perspective is correct. One approach pushes us to search for the right answer. That answer is there, existing out there in the world, if only we could gather the correct facts. Another way of answering that question, a more nuanced approach, will tell us that there are many perspectives on Eyüp. Where people locate Eyüp has much to do with their own histories and positions in the world. But there's a third way of answering the question. Locating Eyüp, and by extension, locating Islam, depends on the practices through which different people enact this place. Sometimes give a view of kind of where the neighborhood sits in relation to the city around it. Eyüp, this is not from 1920, 1922, I forget exactly. It is located just outside the Byzantine land walls along the Golden Horn. So for those of you, again, who are about to find Istanbul, this is a key site. The current municipal and district boundaries are much bigger, and so I can talk about that if you want. But my book really just focuses on a small part of the district's historic, cultural, and religious center. But you can see roughly in this section here. Eyüp takes its name from Khalid bin Zayd Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, companion of the Prophet Muhammad. As the stories go, Khalid bin Zayd joined one of the first Arab sieges of Constantinople and died in battle in the 7th century. Although accounts differ on the precise details, he was buried and his grave was gradually lost from view. At the same time, under the Byzantines, this district was known as Cosmidium and was known for its monastery to St. Cosmos and the healing waters of a well located in the district center. And again, there's another theme running through this book that other people have written about much more ably, thinking about the ways in which Byzantine holy sites come to be transformed into kind of key shrine sites for a Muslim empire. When the Ottomans captured the city in 1453, Khalid bin Zayd's tomb is miraculously rediscovered by Akşemseddin, the Sultan Fatih Sultan Mehmed, so Sultan Mehmed, the conqueror's Sufi advisor. This, again, exact accounts differ of what happened, but the basic contours of the story is that the Sultan asked Akşemseddin to find the location of this tomb. Akşemseddin retreats to contemplation. Perhaps he falls asleep. Perhaps it's a dream. He wakes up and says, "Ah, I found it," and walks to the site and says, "This is where it is." Puts a seedling or a flag in the ground. And the Sultan, to test him, says, "Are you sure?" and has someone secretly move it. And Akşemseddin comes back to the same time. So this is the place. And the idea is they dig down at a length of roughly 2 meters. Is that the exact term? But they discover the body of Khalid bin Zayd, miraculously preserved. And the Sultan immediately says, "I'm going to build a tomb on this site." It becomes the mosque, and this mosque actually becomes the first purpose-built mosque in Istanbul. So this is even all the other major mosques that, of course, Hagia Sophia are conversions of Byzantine churches. Eyüpsultan Çiğdem Kafescioğlu has written so wonderfully in Constantinople, Istanbul. As she points out, this is the first site that is a purpose-built Muslim mosque in the city, by the Ottomans at least. There is Arabjan as well. Eyüp was also more important, and there's a broader history that I don't touch on. My book really focuses on the 20th century history, but Eyüp, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, becomes important as a funerary complex. There are extensive cemeteries there, tombs there, medrese, Sufi lodges. The shoreline also becomes an important site for Ottoman cultural activities. Many of the members of the imperial family build large mansions along the shoreline. What will happen in the 19th century and accelerating over the course of the 20th century, Eyüp becomes a working class district. So this big building that you see here in red is Festhane, which is known as sort of the first state-supported factory in the Ottoman Empire, so-called because it produced the fez, later becomes a textile factory. Over the course of the 20th century, the shoreline of the Golden Horn more or less completely filled in with factories, warehouses, depots, and a variety of things related to Istanbul's character as an industrial city. Meanwhile, in the hillsides above, they were gradually filled in with new housing for those workers to live in. There are a series of major urban interventions over the course of the 20th century, most notably building Eyüpsultan Boulevard, which runs all the way down from the Edirne Asfalt, sort of near where Edirne Kapı is, down from the ridge down into the center area. This is part of, again, for those who know the history of 20th century Istanbul, a project known as the Menderes operations, where the then Prime Minister of Turkey sponsored a series of kind of very massive and far-reaching urban interventions into the city to open it up for. In Eyüp, this takes a particular form where there used to be a charsha, a market, immediately in front of the mosque. Menderes levels it and kind of actually destroys a large section of the neighborhood otherwise. But what happens is that Eyüp, the center of the mosque, was Meydan the square, becomes a sort of key site of transportation and sort of cultural intercourse for much of the 20th century. Another key point that I'll allude to in a little bit is also the story about the 1980s with Mayor Bedrettin Dalan. So following Turkey's 1980 military coup, the reorganization of the municipalities in 1984, the mayor of the greater Istanbul municipality is named Bedrettin Dalan, who basically wipes out industry with a bulldozer. He takes a bulldozer to both sides of the Golden Horn, moves industry to the outskirts of the then outskirts of Istanbul, and tries to reimagine the Golden Horn as a sort of new space of cultural tourism. And we can talk more about that if people will. And so really, I mean, I spent much of my field work between 2011 and 2013 in a handful of places. The bookstore over here, there's a small community center that I do a lot of work. I was in archives sometimes, but a lot of my work was sort of what anthropologists would do as well, sort of deep hanging out. I'm spending time just being in the neighborhood, building relationships with people. And again, I'd be happy to talk more about that field work if people have questions about the methods that I don't know. So there's a very quick, rough overview, a welcome to Eyüp. So it's kind of like where we sit in the city. And again, in a bigger map, the historic peninsula Fatih would be here, the Byzantine landlords are there, Fatih's here. Topkapı Palace, sort of the Saray Burnu, the point is down here. Galata and Taksim are sort of roughly on this side, and then of course you have the Bosphorus over here, and imagine Üsküdar and everything else on the eastern shore and southern shore. So a brief welcome to Eyüp. What we're seeing in the back. This is the tomb, and this is a recent-ish photo. And I'll talk some more about this in the screen. Right. So, where is Islam? Is anyone just out of curiosity familiar with Shahab Ahmed's book, What is Islam? So, if you end up, it's a good thing to know. The recent came a couple of years, 5 years, 6 years ago. It's a massive book. You don't need to spend too much time thinking about it. But one of the things that Shahab Ahmed is trying to do is to argue against a definition. I mean, he's working through hundreds of pages, kind of trying to develop for him a richer version of Islam that is not bound up in sort of the orthodoxy of the Quran and Hadith. And instead, kind of think about the ways that Islam comes to be lived in a complicated, sort of often paradoxical set of experiences. So in thinking about the book, the starting place for me is a critique that geographers often make of everybody else, which is instead of beginning with what, so the definition of what, we ought to begin with the definition of where. So in our intervention as geographers, so that actually geography is not simply a backdrop, it is not simply a stage, but it is actually the making of place, as I like to think in this book, is a constitutive part of the ways that we come to live in the world. So let me just read a short section from the argument that I think makes a slightly a clear introduction to this. So one central challenge for scholars of Islam has been negotiating the relationship between a universal Islam and its local context and practices. And this is the way the debate is almost always framed. And I see a clear through line from Dale Eichelman's call for what he called a middle ground between village locales and the Islam of all times and places. And Philal Asad's conceptualization of Islam as a discursive tradition, to Shahab Ahmed's recent call to focus on the local Muslim's idea and perception of being a member of the diverse and differentiated universal Islam, Ummah of Islam, because local Islams conceive, even if differently, of universal Islam and of themselves by reference to it. And in reading all of this work, one of the things I realized is that I think historians, scholars of Islam often lack, they're obviously brilliant, but they lack a certain vocabulary. And one of the things that I've kind of found is that this concept of place that may sort of draw from a long tradition geographical provides a really sort of powerful and useful way to kind of engage at precisely this question. How do we move between a sort of local experiences and practice of everyday practices of Islam and some need for a sort of broader world of Islam within Jimmy Leiden's kind of scholarship or thinking of universal Islam, as Dale Eichelman comes to talk about. Scholars have taken up this question of negotiating between the local and the universal in a variety of ways. Working both archivally and ethnographically, some have followed the routes and networks through which Muslims move. Others have examined how different Muslims imagine their lives, helping us understand the Ummah, communities of believers, that the Ummah is a flexible and contingent geography. Another approach reminds us that the religious significance of ostensibly local sites and spaces depends upon relationships to elsewhere. Finally, others have offered the ecumen as an alternative concept to concepts like civilization or community, arguing that it can represent the overlapping dimensions of a potentially global and cohesive nexus. So in kind of the framework that I like to use, that I sort of draw on, is thinking about what we could call places of Islam. But as I use this term, and again, trying to bring it back into conversation with a scholarship in Islamic studies and the anthropology of Islam in particular, extending Nseng Ho's phrasing for people who knows the brilliant book Graves of Tarim, places help to give representational shape to a given tradition. Being part of a tradition and a place thus involves more than simply existing within a given space and requires cultivating relations that mutually define traditions, communities, and the places where they emerge. Both traditions and places are always connected elsewhere, and their geographies do not trace neatly onto the map. This approach complements recent conceptualizations of the Islamic ecumen and builds on recent critiques of thinking about Islam or the Hajj, as Lale Janna's eloquently put, as things or objects simply managed or instrumentalized, instead drawing our attention to the simultaneously embodied and imagined relations that define geographies of pilgrimage. And so a key thing to stress here is that an argument to think about the place of Islam is not an argument that we shouldn't think about traditions, that we shouldn't think about other kinds of things, but it's that place, sort of the messiness of the world that we are always engaged in making, is sort of ought to be understood as sort of central to that object. Again, we learn about Islam by means of places. And so what we can do then is understand, well, how is it that different groups come to understand what those places are, how they're used, the rules that guide them. The place that I focus on in the book is this place of Eyüp. So that's the kind of my example of the story. In thinking about place, there's also something else that I'm trying to kind of develop in the book. And it's a critique of the ways that we often think about geography. And the most common way that people often think about geography is that we somehow exist in space. And the example of the map is a really good one. If I said, imagine the world, many of us, all of us would use the map as a kind of way and say, oh, if we're zooming down, we're so used to using our phones to pulling out Google Maps and to somehow zoom from a big scale to a small scale. And the idea is that, well, that we kind of sit within these neatly nested containers. And so the metaphor of space as a container, I think, is a really powerful one that underpins a lot of conversations within history, within sociology, within anthropology. But it's one that many geographers and myself as well critique, we find lacking. And so the alternative metaphor that I try to develop in the book is that we live in places made by connection. So from space as a container to place as a connection for me is the sort of metaphors that I try to think through in the book. Why? Places, as I use them, help us to get out of the local global trap that I've been talking about. They also help us to get out of the methodological nationalism that defines so many studies of Islam, particularly in Turkey. Because of the history of 20th century Turkey, studies of Islam are invariably about the Turkish state. And so the argument, or one of the things I find useful about place as a concept, is it provides an alternative way to enter into that conversation. There are obviously lots of different ways to get at place and placemaking. The way that I choose to do so in the book is through a focus on what I call building stories. So this is a term that I can pull together. It does a couple of things for me. First, these two words in Turkish, bina and rivayet, and in Arabic, riwaya. I know rivayet isn't exactly storytelling, but it's a sort of, and I can talk about why that is, but it sort of helps me structure the book into these two parts. But it also speaks to a recent term within geography, an interest in stories and storytelling as a conceptual framework, a methodological orientation, and sort of like critical positioning. It draws on a long tradition of scholarship looking at how the meanings of buildings are narrated and constructed. So we tell stories about buildings to make them mean. But it also engages with recent conversations about the materialities of story and storytelling. Understand that stories are not simply words, but stories are also made up of the materials through which they are transmitted and shared. So with that, I'm going to jump forward to one of the chapters in the book, or one of the sections of the book, called Dreams of Conquest. And so to set the stage, this comes in the first chapter of the book where I focus, the story of Khalid bin Zayd is consistent over centuries. And yet I kind of pull out three moments in which this story has been told in the 20th century to think about storytelling as an act, not simply done by individuals, but storytelling as an act embedded in the city. So embedded in the context in which it happens. And so I focus on an essay published in 1922 by the writer Yahya Kemal, who would take the last name Beyatlı, who's a key figure in 20th century Turkish literature. So, city letters from occupied Istanbul. In May 1922, there might have been many reasons for Istanbul residents to pick up a daily newspaper like Tevhidi Efkar. The city itself was under occupation by British, French, and Italian forces. The victors of World War I were busy negotiating a post-war settlement. They're trying to figure out how did we lose Iraq. And above all, there was a war in Anatolia between Turkish forces led by Mustafa Kemal Atatürk and their Greek opponents. But were they to turn past those events on the front page, they would have found an essay situated closer to their homes. Beginning, Eyüp, the Turk city of the dead, lingers verdant like an Islamic garden of paradise on the shore where Europe ends. To those who enter this city, when they like translated that one, when they felt those who enter the city, when they felt lost in a dream of cypress and tiles, know that they are truly in a dream. Because Eyüp was a dream that the Turkish army that had come to conquer Istanbul in the spring of the year 1857, which means 857 Hijri, 1453, saw before the walls. In a city under occupation, one in which many ostensibly certain truths were up for debate, Yahya Kemal's choice to begin his essay with a retelling of the city's conquest thus made a particular claim about Eyüp and Istanbul more generally in a period of rapid change. Istanbul had been under joint occupation of British, French, and Italian forces since November 1918. For some, the city's occupation was experienced as a cause for celebration. For others, it was an occasion for despair. Yet regardless of residents' evaluation of the city's occupation, the cultural geographies of the city's everyday life were reconfigured in far-reaching ways. Although the Ottoman Empire still existed as a political entity in 1922 and was ostensibly governed by Sultan Mehmed VI and a succession of cabinets from Istanbul, it was clear to everyone involved that the future of both Istanbul and the empire would bear no resemblance to the empire that entered World War I in 1914. And so here's the thing to stress is that this essay comes out in a moment of political instability, when it's not yet certain what things are going to be like, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is like the nationalist forces are advancing in Anatolia, and there's a sense that they've gained an advantage. But the outcome of everything is still uncertain. So they're kind of to read this as a way of claiming Istanbul by retelling the story. What would the city's complex social, religious, economic, and linguistic landscapes look like in the event of a nationalist victory? What would the city's future look like in the event of a nationalist defeat? In newspapers, the satirical press, and the broad and urban culture of 1922, writers, intellectuals, artists, residents, refugees, and visitors alike both critiqued the city's present and imagined many possible futures. The city was home to nationalists, internationalists, liberals, conservatives, refugees, exiles, itinerant Sufis, South Asian migrants, Islamists, communists, pan-Turkists, Arab families, and more. Newspapers were published in Ottoman Turkish, French, Greek, Armenian, and English, addressing a multilingual audience across the city. There were flyers pasted to walls, a vibrant magazine trade, bustling coffee houses and reading rooms. Live music and records connected Istanbul streets, and above all, the bustling center of Beirut to the world. So to kind of set the stage, think like, what's at stake for Yahya Kemal to kind of turn to this peripheral district, because Eyüp was in many ways peripheral in 1822, and to tell a story about the conquest of the city. In 1922, he was one of Istanbul's best-known writers and public intellectuals. He drew inspiration from a range of sources over the course of his life, including everything from French symbolist poetry to Greco-Roman antiquity to a tradition of divan poetry. Following the Balkan Wars and World War I, however, his views crystallized. Articulating a position in which Turkishness and Islam were tightly woven together, he set out to explain his presence as the outcome of a historical struggle. He brought that interest to bear in his essays during the early 1920s, of which this essay is one. And it's later reprinted in a book called Aziz Istanbul for anyone interested. So later in his life, he would comment on these essays as an attempt to describe these essays as an attempt to comment. The word he uses is tashrih, so sheikh, on nearly all of old Istanbul's spiritual districts, the Ruhani Center, in order to tell the story of the making of this land, Tevekkün edişi, the land of the nation, Vatan Toprağı. Most of these essays were published in the newspaper Tevhid-i Efkar, which was known for its support of the national movement led by Mustafa Kemal in Anatolia. So in one sense, his writing builds upon a tradition of late 19th and early 20th century newspaper known as the City Letter, which had emerged during the latter part of the 19th century and flourished following the 1908 constitutional revolution. These usually shared a set of tropes. The writer, almost always male, would visit some section of the city and use a passing observation or encounter to comment on contemporary urban mores. These columns drew upon and helped to reproduce what Amy Mills has called an imagined cultural geography that located various social groups by emplacing their histories and identities in different areas. And so what happens is that in writing these columnists come to teach their readers how to understand the cultural geography of the city. But in a city under Allied occupation, the question of locating oneself took on new importance. Choosing to ground himself in Istanbul's spiritual districts in the midst of the occupation and war in Anatolia signaled Kemal's politics. He sought to tell a story about Istanbul that both recentered its margins and used Turkishness and Islam to make Istanbul the land of the nation. Leaving Istanbul's central districts, which again were under occupation, for its margins, signaled an attempt to tell a story about Istanbul that linked Turkishness and Islam in a particular way. So in this essay, he developed this argument in two linked ways. First, he does so rhetorically. I mean, to think about the way he structures the essay as a series of envelopes. He begins with his experience, then he goes back to the experience of Fatih Sultan Mehmed in 1453. And in the central episode is the moment in which the Prophet Muhammad meets Khalid bin Zayd in Medina. And this is kind of when Khalid bin Zayd first becomes a companion of the Prophet. But the outer envelope begins by imagining a visitor lost in contemplation of Eyüp's cypress trees and the tiles of the mosque at Eyüpsultan. This visitor, waking from Eyüp's dream of cypress trees and tile, might say, "Where am I? This place where I'm found recalls a verdant garden of paradise. And yet how strange it is that the ruins of the famous palace which the Greek Caesars named Blackernine are here. These walls which stretch in either direction were those Caesars' line of defense. Here, by the name of Eba Eyüp Khalid, lies a companion, born in Medina, who spoke in conference with Muhammad. Where is Medina? Where are the towers of the Byzantine palace? What connection, and the word he uses is munasabet, is there between them?" And so this is, I think, for me, a compelling example of the ways in which connection is being articulated. Yahya Kemal is trying to, he says, he looks the physical proximity of this neighborhood. He says, here are these remnants of the Byzantine past. And again, it's useful to understand the ways in which this is happening in the context of the rediscovery of Byzantine architecture and Istanbul's Byzantine heritage. And so he says, wait a minute, I have these physically proximate buildings that are built by the Byzantines. What is this place doing, and what is its connection, to this person, this place, and also this history? In the middle envelope, he then turns to the moment of the city's conquest in 1453, a historical reference with obvious resonance given the city's occupation and the growing strength of nationalist forces. However, Kemal made this noteworthy choice to include a second event when he narrated the city's conquest, the doubt of Sultan Mehmed II Grand Vizier, Chandarlı Halil Pasha. After this apparent digression, Kemal turned to the central story of Halil bin Zayd. And again, the idea, the key thing to understand about Halil bin Zayd is he was known as the Mihmandar, so the host of the Prophet. But when the Prophet flees Mecca from Medina, he arrives in Medina, and his camel stops at this house, and this happens to be the house of Halil bin Zayd. And the idea that the Prophet had just let his camel stop it, where his camel go. And so because of this, the honor that is bestowed upon Halil bin Zayd, he's known, at least in the Ottoman sources, as the Mihmandar, the host of the Prophet Muhammad. And so in many ways, that story is one that we hear elsewhere. But Kemal's essay is not simply a story about the story of Istanbul's conquest to rally support for the nationalist cause. In making Eyüp the land of the nation, he was also addressing two other debates that were playing out in the city of London. First, what was the proper practice of Islam? And second, what was the relationship between a Muslim identity and other forms of ethnic, linguistic, racial, social, or national association? As they did in many other contexts around the Muslim world in the early 20th century, debates about proper Islam intersected with global discourses of progress, modernity, and rationality. In that, many writers of the late Ottoman Empire sought to redefine Islam by criticizing what they held to be traditional religious institutions and practices such as Sufi orders and tomb visitation. So again, Eyüpsultan is being used as a tomb. So his choice was a kind of it's a polemical intervention. Even assuming that one was able to agree on a definition of proper Islam, these debates are entangled with fierce arguments about the relationship between Muslim identity and other possible identities, above all, one founded on Turkishness. So again, what's happening is that there's a debate between Istanbul intellectuals. Is Islam a sort of superseding common identity for all members of the empire, whether they're Arab, Kurd, or Turk? Not to name only three. Or is Turkishness the sort of defining feature after which Islam comes second, in which case that has very real political implications for non-Turk members of the empire? So the last note to kind of finish with this about the story is just this neat kind of observation about the story, seemingly unconnected, that he tells about Chandarlı Halil Pasha, which the way I interpret in the book, it's a commentary actually on people who are uncertain about the success of Mustafa Kemal. So in the way he draws, I argue that he draws a parallel between Fatih Sultan Mehmed, who eventually captures Istanbul, and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who's advancing in Anatolia. Those who are wavering, those who are not sure whether the city will be captured, like Chandarlı Halil Pasha, are the ones who are slated for execution. So I think there's a kind of political intervention, a critique that he's making of even Turks who are living in Istanbul, who are ambivalent about the success of the nationalist cause. So that's one part of this. The book also, in a different chapter, I take on the theme of water. And water is really everywhere in this. And so I'll just kind of talk briefly about this because I want to keep an idea in time to make sure that I don't talk for an hour and a half. So I want to start with another journal that actually is, again, 1920. And is a young man starting to keep a journal about his trips to Eyüp. In later decades, he would become one of Turkey's best-known cultural historians and an important teacher of traditional arts such as calligraphy, paper weaving, and bookbinding. In 1920, however, Ahmet Süheyl Bey, the author who prepares this journal, was only 22, about to graduate from medical school and complete his training in calligraphy at the Madrasa of Calligraphy. The first few pages of the journal, which you don't see here, consisted of a few pasted-in photographs and an index of his various visits to the district. The journal really began on the next page. With great care, Enver composed a Bismillah in careful fluid script. In the name of Allah, the most gracious, the most merciful. A brief signature followed in the style of practiced calligraphers. Kudride Suhail wrote this. You can find that there. The bottom left on the Bismillah. But all this signals the kind of the care with which he began the story. And then what follows is he takes Menakibi Halidiye. So these are kind of the tales of Halid. Again, a genre of literature that's circulating in late 19th century empire. You can find numerous printed copies of this. And what he's done is he's gone and he's copied out a prayer in Arabic that one is supposed to say on entering the tomb. And then the part that I love about this are these 4 seals at the bottom. And what they are, they're the seals that the Turvedar, the tomb attendant, would have kind of be given as part of the work. And as he says in a kind of really small passage at the bottom, that these seals are what what would happen is visitors would come visit the tomb and they would take a couple of them. And the Turvedar would put their seal in the water, at which point people would drink it as an offering. Nazar is what he uses a backward and everything. But the idea of kind of pointing to the central role that water plays as a devotional substance in Eyüp and in the mosque in particular. So crucially, this is an act of placemaking because by going and visiting a mosque or by going and visiting a tomb, you are helping to define it and redefine it as a tomb. Pilgrims visit the tomb of Khalid bin Zayd, offer their prayers, arrange their bodies in gestures of respect, and drink from the water provided by the tomb's attendant. Pilgrims were linked to this place through their encounters with water. So by ingesting the water, of course, they are connecting themselves, embodying a relationship between themselves and this place of Islam. But you find water in many places in the world. It flows from faucets in the inner courtyard of the mosque. It flows from ablution fountains in the mosque's outer courtyard. It flows through wells and cisterns. It flows through stream beds, though these are largely lost from view. But water never exists on its own. It requires objects and infrastructures to make it accessible in particular ways. Water is offered, sold, and shared. It links, springs, and sustains. Through water, Eyüp is linked to many places and times. There are fluid connections to Istanbul, Ottoman geographies, and the broader world of Islam. Water is the matter of life, as the Quran teaches and is often inscribed on Ottoman-era fountains. From water, every living thing. Have those who believe not considered that the heavens and the earth were a joined entity, and we separated them and made from water every living thing, the Quran says. Then will they not believe? But water, and this is one of the things that I found, is also a contested substance. And so thinking about the roles that wells play. So there's a central well, which I was never able to see, that sits within the tomb. The tomb is built into the mosque, and so if you come into the mosque, you find 4 fountains, and I kind of explain a little bit more. So you have the central tomb of Khalid bin Zayd, with a well inside. Nobody gets to drink from it. Then in the outer courtyard today, you have these 4 fountains that everybody comes and visits, and there's often a very specific devotional practice that people will come and drink from the water in turn to ask for help, to ask for good wishes, to ask for the success of their children, and so forth. But there are also other wells in Eyüp, and this is a story that I want to kind of talk about. So there's a little ways down, it's now closed, but a little ways down is another tomb, and there used to be a well outside. When I was there, starting in 2011, it was only closed by a metal box. And as a friend of mine, somebody who I met in the process, who grew up in the neighborhood, he said, there used to be a well, but the municipality actually came and covered it up. Because what would happen is that kids, being kids, would go and be like, oh, isn't it really funny we can pee in this? But meanwhile, people would come and actually think and approach the well as a devotional site. And they would go and they would kind of actually try to drink water from the well. And so the municipality, both from a public health concern, but also from a governing the proper practice of Islam concern, actually came in and covered things up. But despite that, I would still see people coming to often pray outside. And so one day I was sitting in the tomb with a person attending it. So one afternoon in 2013, I was sitting with my acquaintance Serdar in the tomb meeting Imam Mehmed, where he was working as an attendant. A man donated a few liras and Serdar handed him receipts. The man walked out and quickly poked his head back in, saying, just thought you should know there's a woman out there pointing in the direction of the covered well, praying, namaz kılıyor, he said. Serdar jumped up and glanced out the window. The woman had quickly finished her prayers and was already walking away. He stepped out and called politely, Hanım Efendi, what were you doing? Do you know that there's no benefit to praying there? When he came back inside, and something I won't talk about today, but just a flag here, is the gendered nature of many of these practices and the ways in which policing gendered behaviors is a key part of the experience of the mosque itself. So when he came back inside, I asked him, does this happen a lot? Yes, Serdar replied. There's some people who even still want to light candles, which we know is absolutely not a part of Islam. That's a part of Christianity, as you know. So Istanbul has long been a city of shared devotional geographies. Although its Christian, Jewish, and Muslim communities each claim distinct sacred sites, there are also places where those boundaries can leak. Eyüp is one such place. 19th century non-Muslim visitors often mention that the mosque itself was closed to non-Muslims. To be able to drink from its fountains was a privilege reserved for Muslims alone. However, the marginal character of Eyüp's other wells makes possible other forms of devotion encounter. For some, like Serdar, this leaky boundary provokes anxiety and the desire to sharply separate between Christian and Islamic practices and places. Jump to the 1990s. So just out of curiosity, has anyone been to Eyüp before? Does anyone recognize this fountain, where this is? So if you go to, and hope inshallah, everybody will go to Istanbul, everybody will go to Eyüp now, and everyone will be able to see this. The mosque sits at the bottom of a big hill. The hill is known by various names, most commonly by people visiting from the United States. It's known as Pierre Loti, for the French poet and writer and Orientalist who allegedly had a house up in the top of the cemetery. It's also known as the Eyüpsultan Hill. But at the bottom of the hill, there's a pathway, paved pathway that runs from the top. At the bottom of the hill is this fountain. And then on the top it says Ebedi Eyüpsultan. So first was for those of you who know Turkish, the way that Turkish identifies people in places is as the suffix lo. So someone from Ankara would be an Ankaralı, someone from Istanbul would be an Istanbullu, someone from Van would be a Vanlı, and so on. So already it's locating, we've got Eyüpsultan. Who are these people from Eyüpsultan? And then Ebedi, eternal things. In the direction, the kind of form of it, it also adopts a model of, it's clearly built on a model of an Ottoman fountain. But again, you can see here, if you go there in person, all of the names on it are written in Latin script. And you can realize, oh, these are people who are buried in the cemetery. This is why they are the eternal inhabitants, the eternal inhabitants of Eyüp, or Eyüpsultan. But the part that I begin with is actually thinking about the inscription itself. Because it's written in Ottoman Turkish, whose public use was outlawed in 1928, and thus today is illegible to nearly everyone who passes by. Is that Arabic? Visitors sometimes ask each other. If their companions know, they'll reply, no, it's Ottoman. But regardless, the illegibility of the script seems to mark the fountain as something older, a reminder of the past. But reading the inscription tells a curious story. He built an adorned fountain, may his prayer be answered. May its proof be Allah, his benevolence Mustafa. May a drinker drink once more, may it bring them health. May it be a gift to Eyüpsultan from Mayor Ahmet Genç. Below, the inscription adds two dates, May 29th, 2002, so obviously the anniversary of the conquest on May 29th, but in 2002, and then 16th Rabi al-Awwal, 1423, the Hijri date. So this is something built not in the Ottoman Empire, but in fact built in 2002. And so the chapter on Topographies kind of talks about some of the ways that Istanbul was transformed following 1994. So again, in the interest of time, I won't kind of run through all of these things. But what happens is the municipality, I can run through a couple of images. I do want to point out one of the things that the book doesn't do, and that I wish it probably did a better job of. Oftentimes in the historiography on Istanbul, and the transformations of Istanbul, 1994 is a key moment of change. It's when Refah, the welfare party, takes control of the Istanbul municipality and many of the district municipalities as well. Recep Tayyip Erdogan becomes the mayor of Istanbul. Someone named Ahmet Genç becomes the mayor of Eyüp. And this is absolutely a crucial moment. But what it obscures is actually some of the interesting things that were happening in Eyüp, in the district municipality between 1984 and 1990. And this has a lot to do with the ways that municipal governance is reorganized. So again, following the coup, the system of municipal governance is totally reorganized. And Eyüp is suddenly recast as a new municipality with its own planning office. And so these planners who are just graduated from sort of the technical universities, architects and urban planners, come and they say, we want to plan a new kind of Eyüp. And so there are a number of figures in the talk about, named in the book, Hatice, Gülgül Yalçın, Gülnur Kadayıfçı, and Hatice Fahrinisa Kara are three kind of key figures who join them as municipality. And then the fourth figure is an architect named Nezih Elzem, who's actually a really important figure in modern Turkish architecture. He comes and starts working for the municipality in 1985. And they develop all of these projects. They have these ideas. They're going to rebuild a market for Arastakash, a palace in the center of Eyüp. They have these like detailed and beautiful projects to redo the landscaping of the entire center of the district. One of the crucial things that is really interesting to look at it is that their vision had no room for the shoreline. It was one that in their view, they wanted to kind of basically route traffic around the center of the thing and preserve the sort of center of Eyüp. They're not able to for a variety of reasons, but the biggest one is they don't have money. So they work for almost a decade. They kind of have all these plans, and suddenly 1994 comes. There's another moment, and again, I can talk more about this. The Tarifa from Doğan Kuban, who's another incredibly well-known and crucial figure, Turkish architect, have another project where they come in the 1990s to kind of, again, restore and redevelop the neighborhood. So they do this very detailed inventory of things. But it all comes to naught because in 1994, you have this political change. And what happens, this political change suddenly gives, you have money available to do things. You have money able to build because the local municipality is now aligned with the city, is now aligned with the state government, or the central government authorities in Ankara. And so you have the ability to kind of restore things. And you can see traces of Nezih Haber's. They don't fully realize his vision, but you can see if you go to Central Area, many of the buildings are very clearly the legacy of the plan and the vision that he had for it. So it's one of the things I wish I talked more on. But again, as I explain more in the chapter, there's also a very big project of re-narrating history. And so this is, again, if you know the history of post-1994 Istanbul, this is the moment in which the government, city leaders and national leaders begin to reinvent themselves, not as children of the Republic, but as grandsons of the Ottoman Empire. So that shift, and Eyüp kind of becomes this key site because, as they say in a variety of ways, they say, Eyüp was left to die. The Republic, they had no care for our values, they had no care for our morals. They just left it to run. And so you would find kind of these frequent spreads on the newspapers, kind of juxtaposing what was and what is. So, oh, here's this kind of decay, this rundown, crumbling cemetery or old Ottoman building, and here's the care that they're taking to restore all of the contents. So they're using the material landscape as this really sort of potent marker of both a sort of historic, different kind of history, but also as a marker of their own success. You can, I think, see parallels between what's happening in 1994 and the ways that the current government continues to use material landscapes as a marker of its own progress. In the ways that now it's often like, hey, look, we built an airport. So if in 1994, it's like, look, we restored this Ottoman building. Now it's, hey, we built this new bridge, we built an airport. But it shares this common goal of using the material landscape to kind of do political work. The story that I wanted to finish with, and I'm kind of talk a little bit about, talk briefly about, is a story about Fethane. So this is the story that was the factory, the first factory of the Ottoman Empire. And it continued to serve as a textile factory throughout the 20th century. It's privatized in the sort of neoliberal reforms of the 1980s, and it's almost destroyed. But they're able to save this factory out of everything else in this landscape. So it's sort of sitting in the middle of lawn. Like if you go in the 1980s, they're trying to figure out what to do with it. So early on in the 1980s, they said, let's turn it into a museum of textile and industry, very much close to this. But in the late 1980s, in this moment of sort of global cultural reinvention, they look to it as the home of Istanbul's modern art museum, or contemporary art museum. And there's a debate like the contemporary art, Çağdaş, contemporary art museum. So what they're doing is they're looking at things like the Tate Modern, the Musée d'Orsay in Paris. They're like, oh, here are these former industrial sites that have been converted into a mall, into a museum. Let's do the same thing with our industrial heritage and turn it into a museum. So it's briefly used as a site for the Istanbul Biennial. And the idea is that there's a protocol in place that was going to become the museum. What happens is 1994. So again, this moment was going to happen. It's fiercely criticized in the sort of conservative Islamist press as a sort of Zionist infiltration. The idea that flying the flag of Israel along with all the other flags on the street above was kind of being accused of being a plot to erode the spiritual and religious importance of Eyüp. Following 1994, the municipality tries to transform it into a nostalgic marketplace. It never closed. When I was there in 2011, it was being used as a fair space. But I heard while I was doing this work that the building was going to be used as the home to a future museum of Sufism. Okay. But now it's this. It's known as Art Istanbul. So what changed? What changed was the 2019 mayoral victory of Ekrem İmamoğlu, marking the first time in 25 years that the Justice and Development Party didn't control the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality. So a full account of that is well beyond the scope of this post. But one of the things that İmamoğlu's administration set out to do is restore buildings comprehensively, and it is a key part of their political politics. Like, we took this building, we restored it, and we turned it into a cultural center. And so you can see this throughout the city, but Art Istanbul Fesan is one of the most obvious. As one admiring interview noted, İBB Heritage, which is not perfect, they're still in the process of trying to destroy the Bostanlar at the city walls. Restoring structures that have been left unproductive, brought new contemporary living spaces for the city, and also rescued the city's symbolic places from destruction. So in these projects, these restoration projects, of which Art Istanbul is one, are both a cultural project and a political investment, seeking to make visible the success of İmamoğlu in the lead up to next year's election. Yet in ways that echo the 1993 debates, the opening of Art Istanbul has been criticized by civil society organizations for its supposed insulting of Turkey's national and spiritual values. A story in Yeni Akit, a conservative newspaper, added to the list of offenses. LGBT propaganda, expressions denigrating religion, dancers in front of a mosque adorned with an English language mahia, painting showing sexual relations, grotesque in nature, naked statues, visuals containing violence against the police, symbols of Satanism, and praise of socialism and communism. The protests are continuing. One of the things that I wrote a little bit about this in the UC Press blog, and a last note of self-critique. One of the things that I didn't stress here, but I think is really important, is yes, this debate happened in 1993, and we see a version of it in 1993. What's different now is that the government controls the prosecutor. And so they've opened a prosecutor case of all the curators. Like there's now a file open with all the curators. And if you know anything about contemporary Turkey and the ways in which activists and civil society opponents are being arrested and kind of basically held, jailed for life, and depending on who we're talking, on charges of insulting or somehow threatening the stability of the nation, is actually an incredibly troubling and worrisome thing to think. So to understand, yes, this happened in 1993, but a crucial shift to today is that now the government, now the Erdogan and kind of his supporters and these conservative factions, they hold the levers of power in a way that they never did in 1993. So if you're interested, you can find a little bit more about that in a recent blog post on the UC Press blog. So in writing the conclusion of this book, I did deliberately refrain from making strong statements about where Istanbul in general and Eyüpsultan in particular, because it has been officially renamed Eyüpsultan. Partly it reflected still an uncertainty surrounding contemporary Turkey, but it was also a deliberate choice to leave this place. And I think coming back to the multiplicity of the place and its histories and its many histories, open to change and revision, to recognize that Eyüp, Fesane, Istanbul, the world in which we live, is a conjunction of many histories and many spaces. So I think that makes a wonderful place to finish. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Would you like to? Yeah. Whoever had a question, please raise your hand.
I might have mentioned this, but we talked about loose reconciliation. Just wondering, has there been, was this kind of a trend in Turkey?
Yeah. So there's a huge literature on this. But the quick following, say, 1980 is the military coup, which sort of like brings cultural politics to the stance, but also creates this, I think, a vacuum for sort of cultural, where can cultural politics go? And so in a variety of ways, the Ottoman past comes to be sort of engaged with in a variety of arenas, in Eyüp in particular, but throughout Turkey. So you see this in things like civil architecture, like celebrations of traditional civil architecture. So you would find like a city of Safranbolu, for example, is a city that's suddenly like discovered in the 1980s, like, and really sort of brought to the fore, like, oh, here's the traditional Turkish house. And, you know, these things have been happening prior to that, but really sort of come to be celebrated even more in the 1980s and 1990s. Throughout Istanbul, I mean, in various places in Istanbul, the Ottoman past comes to be, it is discussed in different ways. In Beyoğlu, for example, is often seen as this cosmopolitan Ottoman past in a way that's, I think, distinct and different from what happens in Eyüp. We can probably look to Konya, as I'm sure, like, there'd be an interesting argument to kind of think about the Ottoman past of Konya. A city like Bursa would also be an interesting one to think about, sort of these landscapes and how they come to be. But yeah, I think the point of the Ottoman past comes to be rediscovered in a variety of different ways in cities all across Turkey.
Thank you so much. It was super interesting. So, when I've been given tours of this thing, the group way that people advise me is like, this is a super secular area. This is a religious area. This is etc. And I'm curious conceptually, how do you demarcate this area and placing this in? When one, there's traditional notions of blood of Islam, whole places being Islam. Also competition with others. When I think of placing Islam, I think of this area that welcomes people, welcomes different people, and an ecosystem. And I'm curious about one, that placing the two, sort of instead of people who are past, what is the living presence of? Are there scholars that work out of the area? Is there Sufi groups that are making claims to that site, or that they're teaching in the area? So,
yeah. So maybe I'll start. So the Sufi questions are really interesting. So maybe start there, and then the bigger one about like placing Islam and like Eyüp and where it sits within sort of religious geography of Islam, but also thinking more broadly about the thought of Islam. So there was this like experience I had doing my fieldwork in 2011, 2013. I like randomly was part of an Ottoman, like learning how to read Ottoman inscriptions summer school. And we've been wandering through Galata, like Tophane, and happened to like be reading an inscription outside of a Qadri tekke. And the sheikh was inside. And they were like, hey, what are you guys doing? Like, what's going on? Like, what are you? And so they invited, like, met the guy there. And then a couple months later, I was like wandering the back streets of Eyüp during Ramadan and saw someone from the Qadri tekke. And he was like, what are you doing? It's like, what are you doing here? So like got invited to like a gathering of people in a Qadri tekke, which is totally out of the way. People wouldn't know where it is. But it's clear that like, and the sheikh or like somebody who's sort of within that, like higher up within that community, had come during Ramadan. It was crowded, and so he was late. He said, I tried to go by the mosque to like give my respects to Hazrat bin Zayd, and there was too crowded, so I just came here. So there's this like network of Qadris, for example, that are like very much like part of the city, and they're sort of connected in various places. But then you have the Naqshbandi, who have a just very different network that operates. And particular, like one of the things that I saw over time is the growth of Menzi. So I mean, we have Suleiman, the Suleiman Jalal, so the Suleimaniye, and you've got Menziv as well. Menziv, the Samarkand's like bookshop, it's there. Like if you wanted to go find it, you could go look there. They were like, I met some of them while doing my field work, so it's clear like they're around and active. Suleiman Jalal have like their Sane that are located in various, like in Quran courses that are located in various parts of the districts. And so people would often come there. When people would go to the mosque, like women, you would be able to tell the Suleiman Jalal because they would tie a tessitura in a very particular kind of way. And so like you could look to other people and you could see like, were men praying like this? Were they praying like this? What kind of skull cap were they wearing? So the ways like Sufi groups are all around. And yet the neat thing to say about it is that they're like Eyüp fits differently into all their geographies. And this is the kind of thing about like the multiplicity of place, is that it's not a Naqshbandi place, it's not a Qadri place. It's a place where all these different groups come and they're sort of like, they share the same physical location. And sometimes they brush up against them. Like sometimes there is debate. And sometimes they're just kind of like there and they do their thing and they go off and move it. So it's like an itinerary in these geography of connection makes up their world. The point about like Eyüp and where it sits in the thing, one of the things I say at the end of the book is that like what I'm not giving the geography of the cultural geography, but it's like a way of thinking instead about a cultural geography of Islam. And I think like Eyüp is only one, like it's one interesting one, but it's only one of very many in Istanbul. And in many ways, it's not even as conservative or like religiously observant as some places that you would go and talk to. Like there are places that I would, like even speaking fluent Turkish, like just walking in and be like, hey, can I learn about like what happens in the religious importance of this place in Fatih? They're like, what are you doing here? Where like my relationship and entry into Eyüp is very different. So I think it's a much bigger conversation like where it sits in the Dar al-Islam. But I think the critique I have of Dar al-Islam framing is that it assumes that one person and another person share the same idea of what that dot is and like what its boundaries are and what its histories are. And yes, there is going to be overlap and people do share those connections, but it's not that they're just in the same container, but it's actually that they learn to understand the traditions and their sort of relationship to them in similar kinds of ways. But yeah, thank you. That's a great question.
So, pretty simple question. What got you started like researching Eyüp in particular? Why not another city or another part of this?
Orhan Pamuk. So I wrote my master's thesis, so partly I have a family connection to Turkey, so that was part of it. But I wrote my master's thesis about Orhan Pamuk's memoir, Istanbul, Memories in the City. And so, like a lot of people, I'm really grateful because I think that book brought, for people like me, brought a whole range of writers into my kind of orbit that I never thought of. So if people have read that memoir, he talks about 4 writers, Reşat Ekrem Koçu, Ahmet Hamid Tanpınar, Yahya Kemal Beyatlı, and why am I forgetting first? And the columnist from the 19th century, Ahmet Rasim, I think is the first one. But Pamuk at one point talks about going to Eyüp, and he calls it a sort of Eastern Muslim Disneyland. I was at the time, like I was taking a grad course on Judith Butler and the body, and like Judith Butler's arguments about how bodies are, like how gender is made. And I was like, oh, I think Pamuk is wrong. Like I don't think he actually understands the ways that this Muslimness is made and remade, because Pamuk comes from a very privileged sort of secular position in Nişantaşı. And he goes, he's like, oh, Islam is something that other people did. So I sort of came into the project thinking, like, oh, how is it that people actually go about making Eyüp a place of Islam? And that sort of brought me in there. And then I got there and was like, hey, everybody. And like what happens with people is like figuring out what the relationship is. Yeah, especially for me. Yeah.
This space stage includes that. That's the great difference. The exhibition means this year. Great artists and all over the place. The artists that I know participated in the thing, they thought it was a great mess because people left out the exhibition. Putting it forward, I think the center department. Do you have any kind of thoughts on?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a good point. I think, and like what they've done, just a little bit of background. So this, the way that they created this like exhibit spaces, they worked with like 28 different curators who were able to pull whatever artist they wanted and put them on the walls. And so I can see that critique that there is as well. There's not a through line with this is, and I think someone who's also like the exhibit catalog. It's like ortadan başlamak, so beginning from the middle. They were like, this makes no, like the Turkish makes no sense. So they were kind of critical of the phrasing of this. But I also met people who were actually, they included a lot of art here, which is quite critical. Particularly, there was art referencing Gezi, which was quite critical of the government, or kind of the police and the state. And so they were praising it because of the difference between this building, which is run by the municipality, and what's happened at Istanbul Modern, which is run by İKSV. Because in their argument, what's happened is that Istanbul Modern has basically decided to like give up on any sort of political critique, to do whatever serves the need of Galata Port and profit generation. And so they see Art Istanbul as like a space for open critique in art, in a way that what's happening with Istanbul Biennial. And Kaya Genç has kind of written a story. I think Kaya Genç would probably be the person to go look for kind of discussion of this. But they see Art Istanbul as actually being more successful because it holds open a space for critique that is being lost in other places. But I think it's also a valid, like, a lot of people have looked at other municipal projects and been like, they don't put the resources behind them. They just sort of slap a lot of things on the wall so they can put up the Instagram post and say, like, look at all the things we've done. So we do these things without a sense of like long range planning. And I think that's an absolute fair worry to have.
I'm really curious whenever this film comes in. As we what makes the Yolu any less of an Islamic space than say or Nişantaşı, whatever. Then I mean, there's a traditional understanding that it's like in your face. But all of these people that you would find in Beyoğlu or Nişantaşı will tell you it's like other Islamic system, but it's different than Islam. It's a secularist, right? So what makes Islam, what makes Eyüp more like an Islamic space as opposed to other places in Islam?
Yeah. I mean, there's a wonderful Yahya Kemal essay about Beyoğlu called Ezansız Semtler. So like the districts without the azan, without the call to prayer. So, and again, and that's precisely in this moment in 1922. So it was talking. I think what makes Eyüp different. I mean, there is a sense that there's like a density of connection. That yes, like I think you're absolutely right. Like Beyoğlu is Muslim because Muslims live there. Like Nişantaşı is Muslim because Muslims live there. But the sort of intensity and density of sort of encountering landscapes as you're walking through Eyüp is different. And I think that's like, I don't know quite how to put it into words, but that's like probably the place that it started, is that like you go through Eyüp and there is a sense of like, you know, it preserves some of the old, like preserve some of the old streets, like you'll walk by cemeteries, you'll walk by mosques, you'll walk by madrasa. And that sort of material, that density of the landscape isn't present in other districts in nearly the same way. I mean, interestingly, it's not even present in Fatih in the same way. Like there's something, it's partly because central Eyüp has sort of mostly been emptied of people to serve the needs of tourism. But there is something, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like one is more Muslim than the other. It's just they're a different way of placing the sun. It's like what I can do. And this is like why I find place interesting, because how do we create a common sense of what these places are?
Listening, please. Thank you all for coming.